Picture this. You're at a wedding. It's mid-July, maybe a little too warm in the church. The bride looks stunning. The groom looks nervous. The officiant steps forward, clears their throat, and begins to read. Love is patient. Love is kind. You almost stop listening, don't you? Because you've heard it 1,000 times. It is the hallmark card of biblical passages. But what if I told you that this passage, 1 Corinthians 13, was never intended to be a romantic poem? What if I told you it was actually a harsh rebuke delivered to a group of people who were tearing each other apart? Hello, and welcome to the show. Today, we are taking the most famous text in the history of weddings, the love chapter from the King James Bible, and we are putting it back into its original gritty context. We're talking about ancient sin cities, the difference between love and charity, and why seeing through a glass darkly isn't just a poetic metaphor, but a technical reality of the first century. Joining me to dismantle the romance and find the real meaning is our resident expert, Alex. Alex, welcome.
It's great to be here, Chloe, and you are absolutely right. If you read 1 Corinthians 13 closely and you know the history behind it, it feels less like a wedding vow and more like a crisis intervention.
A crisis intervention? It is a strong pivot from love is patient.
It is, but you have to look at who Paul was writing to. This letter was sent to the church in Corinth. Now, to understand Corinth in the first century, you can't think of a quiet, pious village. You need to think of Las Vegas combined with New York City's Wall Street.
So, wealthy and wild?
Exactly. Corinth was a major port city in Greece, controlled by Rome. It was incredibly wealthy, culturally diverse, and morally, let's say, flexible. It was famous for the Temple of Aphrodite. In fact, in the ancient world, to call someone a Corinthian was actually a slang term for living a life of debauchery. And the church that started there, it was a mess.
A mess in what way? Like they weren't paying their tithes?
Much worse. They were suing each other, they were getting drunk at the communion table, they were fighting over which leader they followed. I follow Paul, I follow Apollos. But the specific issue that triggers chapter 13 is a fight about spiritual superpowers, basically.
Superpowers? You mean the gifts mentioned in the text?
Right. The Corinthians were obsessed with status. In their society, status was everything, and they brought that obsession into the church. They believed that having flashy spiritual gifts, like speaking in tongues or prophesying the future, made them superior Christians. It was a spiritual pecking order. I speak in tongues more than you, so I'm closer to God.
Okay, so Paul writes this chapter not to say, isn't love nice, but to say, stop showing off.
Precisely. Look at the very first verse. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. That isn't just poetry, it's a specific cultural burn.
Break that down for us. What is sounding brass in this context?
Well, historians point out that in the worship of Dionysus and Cybele, popular pagan cults in that region, they used loud gongs and cymbals to induce ecstatic frenzies. It was just noise and emotion designed to work people up. Paul is essentially telling them, you think your speaking in tongues makes you angelic? Without love, you're just making the same annoying noise as the pagan cult down the street.
That is savage. He's comparing their holiest moments to pagan noise pollution.
He is, and that sets up the central tension of the translation you provided. The King James Version uses the word charity. Most modern Bibles use love. This is a huge point of confusion for people.
I've always wondered about that. To modern ears, charity sounds like giving $5 to the Red Cross. It feels cold. Why did the King James translators choose that word?
It's a fascinating linguistic choice. The Greek word Paul uses is agape. The Greeks had multiple words for love. They had eros for sexual passion, philia for friendship, storge for family affection, but agape was different. It referred to a selfless, willful, unconquerable benevolence. It's not a feeling you fall into, it's a decision you make.
So eros is I want you, and agape is I sacrifice for you.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to 1611, when the King James Bible was published. The translators knew that the English word love was already getting slippery. It could mean romance, it could mean lust. They wanted a word that specifically captured the selfless, active nature of agape. They chose charity because it comes from the Latin caritas, which means a high price or something precious. In 1611, charity didn't just mean giving alms, it meant a disposition of loving kindness toward one's neighbor.
So they were trying to protect the word from being confused with romance?
Yes, they wanted to emphasize that this is a love that does things. Look at verse 3. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. This is the irony. You can do the act of charity, giving away your goods, without having the spirit of charity.
That distinction is crucial. You can be a philanthropist for the wrong reasons, for tax breaks or applause, and Paul says that is a spiritual zero.
Zero. I am nothing, he says, and then he moves into that famous list. Charity suffereth long and is kind, charity envieth not. When we hear this at weddings, we think it's a checklist for a happy marriage, but in context, it's a checklist of exactly how the Corinthians were failing.
So when he says, charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, he's implying the Corinthians were puffed up.
He's not implying it, he's calling them out. We know from earlier in the letter that they were incredibly arrogant about their knowledge. The phrase puffed up, phusio in Greek, appears repeatedly in 1 Corinthians to describe their attitude. They were arrogant about their freedom, arrogant about their gifts. So Paul is holding up a mirror and saying, you think you are spiritual giants? Well, love isn't arrogant. Love doesn't seek its own way. You are doing all of those things.
It's really a character assassination of their ego, disguised as a definition of love. I want to jump to the end of the chapter because the imagery gets very interesting there. He talks about putting away childish things, and then he uses this famous phrase, "For now we see through a glass darkly."
This is one of my favorite metaphors in the New Testament because it relies so heavily on the technology of the time. When we hear glass, we think of a window or a silver-backed mirror that gives a perfect reflection, but they didn't have that in the first century.
What were they using?
Corinth was actually famous for manufacturing bronze mirrors. These were just discs of polished metal. Even the most expensive, highly polished bronze mirror gives a distorted, dim reflection. You have to squint to make out your own features. The Greek phrase there, enigmati, is where we get the word enigma. It literally means in a riddle.
So he's saying our current spiritual understanding, even with all these fancy gifts of prophecy the Corinthians loved, is like looking into a piece of polished brass?
Right. He's relativizing their superpowers. He's saying, you guys are so proud of your prophecy and your knowledge, but you're just looking at a blurry reflection in a piece of metal. He contrasts that with the future, but then face to face.
Face to face? That sounds immediate, unfiltered.
It implies total intimacy and clarity. In the ancient world, to see a king or a god face to face was the ultimate privilege. Paul is arguing that all these spiritual gifts they are fighting over are temporary tools for a time of blurriness. One day, the blurriness will end, and we won't need prophecy anymore, because we will be in the presence of the truth itself.
Which brings us to the famous conclusion. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity.
This is the mic drop moment. He picks three massive theological virtues. Faith and hope are essential, obviously, but he elevates charity, agape, above them. Why? Because faith and hope are temporary.
Wait, faith is temporary? That sounds heretical.
Think about the logic. Faith is the conviction of things not seen. Once you see God face to face, you don't need faith anymore. It becomes sight. Hope is the expectation of something future. Once you've received the reward, you don't need to hope for it. But love? Love is the only one that carries over into eternity. It is the language of heaven. That is why it's the greatest. It's the only thing that doesn't become obsolete.
That fundamentally changes how I view this text. It's not about finding a partner who is patient and kind. It's about building a community that values the permanent virtue of love over the temporary flash of status.
Exactly. The Corinthians were chasing the temporary, the flash, the noise, the status. Paul is trying to anchor them in the eternal.
It's a lesson that seems just as relevant today. We might not be fighting over tongues and prophecy, but we certainly fight over status, being right, and having the loudest voice in the room.
We are all clanging cymbals sometimes. The challenge of 1 Corinthians 13 is to stop making noise and start practicing that difficult, selfless agape.
Alex, thank you for walking us through the history and the Greek behind this masterpiece. It turns out the love chapter has a lot more teeth than I thought.
My pleasure. It's always good to wipe the dust off the mirror.
And thank you for listening. Next time you're at a wedding and hear these verses, you can lean over to your neighbor and whisper, "Did you know this is actually about ancient bronze manufacturing?" Or maybe just enjoy the moment. Until next time, keep listening.